Hello, and welcome to a little book bag extra as we learn of the huge news of the death of Martin Amis, an enormous figure here in Britain, and somebody whose talent was simply unignorable. Like him, loathe him, anywhere in between. If you were interested in books, you were interested in what Martin Amis had to say, almost by definition. And it's very curious. I was thinking about him only recently. I just did the interview with John Walsh for the book bag, and we talked very fondly of Martin Amis and how strange it is. That wasn't so very long ago, and it's already a different literary era. He was still alive as we spoke about him, and how very different the world, the literary world, seems now. And on top of that, I thought about him only the other day. I was in Primrose Hill and I passed Cecil Sharp House, which took me back to the only time I've really met Martin Amis. I was chairing an event with him in Cecil Sharp House, and I went to meet him beforehand at his home, which was nearby. And as I walked along the street just a couple of weeks ago, I thought, I wonder which house was Martin Amis's. I couldn't really recall. They were all stucco palaces, and I couldn't recall, but it did take me back to that one time, as I say, I did meet Martin Amis. But as a literary editor, he was somebody who you just had to take note of, not least because editors were always asking you what he was up to. We couldn't have afforded him, I don't think, on the Independent on Sunday. But when the news came that he had died, I did dig out a couple of books, and I had this copy of his fantastic collection of essays and reviews, The War Against Cliche. What a fantastic title. And it's even still got the sticker at the front from Jonathan Cope to indicate that it is a review copy. And in it, he does thank various editors, including Blake Morrison at the Independent on Sunday. So I remember when I joined, we had these big books where we recorded names of contributors, and I seem to recall that Martin Amis had been on a retainer. Certainly wasn't anything I could afford in my day, but that little reference to Blake Morrison, who's also, of course, been in the book bag, did remind me that did actually happen. He did once write for us. Martin did once write for us, and this is a fantastic book. I've been dipping into it. It's not the sort of thing that you ever read all the way through, and I don't think I did read all the way through. But I do remember reading this. This is about Iris Murdoch, and I absolutely adore and revere Iris Murdoch. It's the end of a review. I suspect that Miss Murdoch's huge productivity is paradoxically a form of self-defense, or self-effacement. 300 pages a year disarm a lot of criticism. She can't, in the nature of things, revise much, and probably she never rereads. She just gets on with the next one. Were she to slow down, were she to allow one of those ominous silences to gather, silences such as more tight-lipped novelists periodically break, she would be accepting a different kind of responsibility to her critics and to her own prodigious talents. She would, in short, begin to find out how good she is, that strange and fearful discovery. I suspect that's a discovery that Martin Amis was continually making throughout his life. I mean, certainly a hard worker, and in terms of diligently removing cliches and making things new to the extent that he didn't mind, I don't think, coming across as even slightly ridiculous. Better slightly ridiculous than to be cliched. And I found this is from the introduction to The War Against Cliche. In the long term, literature will resist levelling and revert to hierarchy. This isn't the decision of some snob of a belletrist, it is the decision of Judge Time, who constantly separates those who last from those who don't. I think, judging from the huge outpouring of appreciation, Omis is definitely somebody who will last. And I remember hearing from my former colleague at Time Out, the inimitable Brian Case, that he was once Martin Amis's tutor, the very young Martin Amis's tutor. Martin's disinclination to do any work when he was at school or read much is well recorded. And Elizabeth Jane Howard, who was his stepmother, apparently took him in hand and put him on the road to reading. But Brian, who was a sort of jazzy hep cat, probably wearing a beret, turned up to tutor the young Martin. He was kind of being crammed as a prelude to getting into Oxford. And Brian said that this very calm and collected boy, really, not much more than a schoolboy, just said to him, look, you don't want to be here. I don't want to be here. You don't want to teach me. I don't want to be taught. Why don't we just, say nothing and go our separate ways? Which apparently is what Brian then went and did. So anyway, back to the only time that I did meet Martin. I mean, as I say, as a literary editor, you had to take note of him. You had to send out his books to review. A lot of times people say, well, how do you know what books to review when there are so many? I mean, some of them are just self-selecting. You would always have to send out a Martin Amis. And one time I even had to have a review in so early, a week before we'd even got the copy, but it was available in the States. Unfortunately, I did know somebody who was in the States on holiday and was on the way back and read it on the plane and came straight into the office and reviewed it. So keen was our editor to get it in the very first week that we possibly could. So some of these authors where editors are really on your back, you kind of get annoyed with them. But anyway, we managed it. And I would read a fair amount of his books. I read his early ones and was hugely impressed, like everybody else. And I absolutely adored Money, and read London Fields, The Information. I mean, they were quite laddish, and I don't think he ever quite appealed as much to women as to men, possibly. But he was impossible not to admire. And the one time that I did meet him, this time I went round to his house, it was for the novel Yellow Dog, which had some pretty severe reviews. It had been quite bashed in the reviews, and he was doing this event. So I went round, and as I think I said in the John Walsh interview, that he was very taken aback by my only wanting half a glass of wine. He thought that was a fairly ridiculous thing to ask for, but he did express some interest in me, in terms of having a conversation, just sitting around chatting. And I say this with some surprise, because a lot of writers are quite self-absorbed and very happy just to talk about themselves, and you're just there to be the sponge, really. But Martin Amis wasn't like that. And I remember one of the bizarre conversations that we did have. I was telling him about my yoga practice and how I was working on a particular sequence that was a hip opener, a hip opening sequence. And he looked at me in complete amazement and said, why would you ever want to do that? A question that I think I made a game attempt at answering that question. But of course, Martin Amis was all about the retox, as he would say himself. So he would have been puffing away on a fag, sloshing his very full glass of red wine. And I remember there being a child around, quite a small child, that he was, not sort of benignly distant. Do I want to say that? I mean, I'm sure he was a wonderful father, but the point was that he didn't have to make a big thing to a visiting journalist about what a wonderful father he was. I mean, he was just totally comfy in his own space with this little kid in the background occasionally wandering in. But what I thought about him at the time was I would not have described him as nice. I would not have described him as a nice person, which is not to say that I thought he wasn't a nice person. It's more that I thought he was more interesting than that. There are more interesting things to be than nice. Let's put it that way. He was quite sharp, could be fairly cutting. He was obviously very charismatic. And he was somebody you felt you slightly had to kind of sit up and not be on your best behaviour, but be your sharpest in return. He wasn't a sort of lie back, relax, and just have a regular chat. He was on it for sure. So we went over the road. We went off to Cecil Sharp House, and it was very awkward the way the whole thing was set up. We were kind of hovering around at the side of the auditorium for a while. Do we go on, or do we start? Like, it's the hour. We're at the top of the hour. Nobody said anything, so we ended up kind of just wandering on and sitting down. And I did my little preamble. And almost immediately we got the cries that you never want to hear. Can't hear, speak up. And so we tried to move the mics, which were completely gaffer taped to the table. And for some reason we had to move the table. We had to start ripping off, before we could even do the event, we had to start ripping off gaffer tape and tugging at leads, and then we both, he took one end of the table and I took the other end of the table. I think maybe the chairs were screwed down. It was all a bit ridiculous. But I remember thinking, well, that, almost one for the CV. I shifted furniture with Martin Amis. I remember him being no bother at all as a person to interview. Very good with the audience, and given that it was Yellow Dog we were talking about, I almost expected him to take on board some of the criticism that had been in the reviews. I suppose as a literary critic, as a reviewer, you always think you're, more influential than you actually are. So I almost expected him to say something on the lines of, well, of course, the critics have pointed out that this book has a few flaws, and I accept that. And he absolutely didn't. And as he talked, I thought, wow, he really does think it's a masterpiece. He really does. And good for him. You probably have to have that kind of attitude if you're going to be a creative artist, as he was, and hold your head up high in the face of criticism. As I say, since it's been announced that he has passed, there's been a lot of eulogy, as there always is, and people saying how marvellous he was. And he was marvellous, but at the same time, partly because he was a public figure, he was also a figure of quite a lot of criticism and some ridicule. Male turkey cocking, I think, was one comment. I can't remember quite who said that, but this idea that literature at the time was a bit of a boys' club, and he was the sort of biggest lad around, and he didn't always get great reviews. But I remember later on, I must have been reviewing this, but I read The Pregnant Widow, and this was at a time when Amy's bashing was probably reaching its height or continuing. And I certainly got to the point then where I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I would. And just again, sentence by sentence, just the sheer kind of fun of the words. I want to say the effort to amuse just came across on every page. You know, this was somebody sort of working very hard at their craft and taking it extraordinarily seriously. I have here an undoubted masterpiece, actually. His what a great picture of him as a little kid. Might be a candy cigarette, I suspect not. This is his memoir experience, and as I took it down from the shelf, I found something rather delightful inside. There he is, gorgeous Martin. Looks like a typical student bedroom, doesn't it? Cutting quite a dash. That's what he was like when he came into literary London, I'm sure. I'm sure the ladies were duly slain. And what this is, it's an invite. You are invited to a party to celebrate the publication of Experience by Martin Amis. It is my invite. My name is at the top. At Cecil Sharp House. So he's obviously still living around the corner. And 9 p.m. to midnight, dancing from 10:30. I don't think I went to this. I have no memory of it. I'm sure I would have gone otherwise. But I must have been away. What a shame. But it's quite fun to see that I still had the invite tucked in there. And yes, to go back to my recent trip past the house he used to live in, possibly if that was it. Of course, he committed the ultimate sin in a way for a English literary person to go and live abroad, to go and live in the States. But as I walked along the road, when he was still alive, I also went past, it's such a lovely area, Primrose Hill. I also went past the house that W.B. Yeats had lived in, which is also the house Sylvia Plath died in. And I went round the corner to the house that Sylvia Plath did live in Chalcot Square. Has its blue plaque. It's a real sort of blue plaquesville round there. And you know, he'll be joining them in the blue plaques eventually. He is now a denizen of that world rather than our world, and it's really very, very sad to think about that. So, R.I.P. Martin Amis. You're one of the ones that will last. I feel absolutely confident about that. Thank you.